what I thought I'd try and do today was kind of give you a bit of my perspective on science and like how I see science, what I think science really is, and then hopefully that can translate into maybe some of what's in the back of your mind when you're teaching science. I'm very deliberately trying to avoid using jargon, so I take what Jane just said about, if you use a term somebody doesn't understand, explain it. When I was chatting to Jane about this, I had to stop her 3 times. I think CPD was the first one. I was like, what's a CPD? So, you can get very used to terms and you forget other people don't use them. So if I do that, I apologize and do please stop me. So I was going to just talk a bit about myself and what I do, and in the hope that that would give a bit of an introduction and a bit of an insight maybe into what it's like to work in science, because I think there's a very common misconception, probably not among you guys, but in the general public, that science is, this series of facts and it's just a pile of stuff that you know. If you're a scientist, you know stuff that other people don't know. And instead, science is actually a process. And it's nice to kind of reflect that. I try to reflect that when I'm teaching at university level, but of course, that's not fair because I'm taking in students who have already been prepared by teachers like you, so I can, start in a different place. But I try and reflect the process, not just present a series of answers, but this is how we think about it, and this is where we went wrong, and this is how we understood how we went wrong. Anyway, so genetics something is my very clever title. So I work in genetics, and it's one of these fields that I think a lot of people do know a lot about, and it's these days people recognize DNA. I think if you show people a picture of DNA, they'll recognize it. And it's a really, really broad science. It is the foundational science of all biology. And so basically everything has DNA, more or less, except viruses, some viruses. And this means that you can translate knowledge across. And so one of the favorite organisms, or a favorite organism in early genetics is this one, E. coli. Most people don't think about it unless they've got a horrible gastro bug, and then they start thinking about E. coli of some sort that came in their slightly undercooked chicken. But E. coli is, of course, a very important bacterium, and it's actually mostly quite safe, so you can work on it in the lab. And loads of early work in genetics was done on E. coli. And so loads of really early work because you can manipulate them, you can grow them very easily. They don't complain about the cramped conditions in the lab. And you can do lots and lots of really clever experiments. And in fact, some of the early work discovering how genes work and how genes are regulated was done on E. coli by these 2 Frenchmen, Jacot and Monod. And so they discovered a lot about how genes are regulated, which is extremely important because if you think about it, when you think about your body, you've got the same genes in every cell in your body, but what makes your heart cells different from your brain cells, different from your skin cells, is which ones are turned on and off, right? So it's the regulation that really is the crux in a lot of genetics. And so, Monod, one of these guys, Monod, made the very beautiful statement. He said, what is true for E. coli is also true for the elephant. And this is basically, this is the key concept in genetics, is because genes and DNA are found everywhere, you can do an experiment in E. coli and understand something about plants. You can do an experiment in fish and understand something general about vertebrates. And this is why genetics is really, really powerful. And then, so I work in genetics, and kind of taking this, you can learn from other animals and other organisms idea kind of even a bit deeper. I work specifically in evolutionary genetics, which means we're looking at DNA, we're looking at DNA sequences, and we're comparing them across everything. So mostly I'm comparing across animals, so mostly across vertebrates, but sometimes we would compare to something as distant as yeast, so like brewer's yeast or baker's yeast. And you can do this because it's possible with DNA because we can still see the similarities, and we can actually learn something from these comparisons. And so I'm just going to show you a picture of my lab because it doesn't look like a typical lab. especially because I've got really nice furniture that I'm very proud of as my standing desk. But we don't have chemicals, and we don't have bottles of stuff, and we certainly don't have purple lights and blue liquids. If it ever happens that somebody needs to come and take a picture, they're always really, really disappointed that we don't have those things. And they usually ask me to stand in somebody else's lab and pretend that I have all these things and, stand beside some chemicals and look more scientisty. But all of the work we do is on computers. All of the data are publicly available. And this means it's actually a very, very accessible kind of science to anybody, including teachers. So we call it bioinformatics or sometimes computational biology, but basically all of the resources are available. So some of these things are easier to use than others. Others take quite a bit of know-how before you can really get into it. But some of them are actually very easy to use with a few little pointers. So there are some things within computational biology that are very accessible and be very easy in a classroom setting, perhaps, if you just had a few computers, a few internet-connected computers. And of course, nobody works alone. No scientist works alone. This is a picture from a few years ago, some of the guys in my lab in the Natural History Museum in Chicago. So I don't know if that's actually the real bones of a T-Rex or if it's, sometimes they have replicas when they put them in, but in any case, it's pretty impressive. And I just put this up here to remind me to make the point that in science, collaboration and discussion are extremely important. So there is a huge amount of information, and there's a lot of puzzles in science. That's basically the most interesting part anyway, is a puzzle. So scientists get most excited about questions they don't know the answer to, not questions they know the answer to, because that's when you're starting a new project. You found a new question and there's something you want to try and figure out. And so everybody works in groups in science. Even if you see a scientist who's publishing alone, I would be completely surprised if they're not in intense discussions with colleagues in their department or even over coffee. You learn a lot from talking to other people. And this is because sometimes what you need in order to have an insight in science is to see something in a different way. You need to think about it in a different way, something maybe that wasn't obvious at first. And some of the things, sometimes when this has happened in my own research, well, one time was when we were looking at human and chimp comparisons. So human and chimp are very different. I happened to find a picture that illustrates that very poorly. Probably the most similar looking human and chimp picture you can find. But so human and chimp are very different at the physical level. You're never going to mistake one for the other. There's a lot of physiological differences, a lot of very noticeable outward differences. But famously, at the DNA level, they're very, very similar. So this becomes an interesting problem because you say, well, if they're so similar at the DNA level and so different at the physical level, where does this difference happen? So somewhere in those very small differences are the big difference. And so we were doing this work where we were looking at comparing human and chimp, and we were actually interested, what we were trying to do was we were trying to find a specific kind of difference which was maybe extra copies of a gene. So we all have more or less the same genes as each other. But sometimes you have slightly different versions of a gene. So, the classic example would be eye color. I think that's the one that gets used most commonly. But so you have different versions of the same gene, or you might have different copies of a same gene. So you might have more of them or fewer of them. So this is the kind of thing we were looking for. We were looking for more copies or fewer copies. And the thing we found that we absolutely were not expecting to find was that we found there were some human genes that we couldn't find in chimpanzee at all. And so we thought, well, okay, this is obviously a mistake. Let's figure out the mistake. So we looked for the kind of mistakes. We said, well, this could be because even though we've got the apparently full DNA sequence from human and the full DNA sequence from chimp, well, maybe there's a few mistakes, like some little bits have been skipped over by mistake. So we can tell if there's a gap because there's a little break in the data. So we'll look for these gaps. And so some of them were explained by these gaps. And they said, well, it could also be that it's just a little mistake in terms of interpreting what is really a gene or not, because you've got the big, long DNA strand and bits of it are genes, and you have to do a bit of interpretation to figure that out. So we said, okay, well, maybe some of these human ones we think are genes that aren't in chimpanzee. Maybe they're not really in human either, so we checked that out. And a few of them were explained that way. And then we also checked, well, maybe they're really in chimp, but nobody noticed, so we did that, and a few of them were explained that way. And then we came up, but there were a few that we couldn't explain. And so there were 3 cases in the end where there is a gene in human where it's very clearly a gene in human. We can see that it produces a protein. We can see that it's present in every human being, but that it's absent in chimpanzee, and none of these boring explanations work. So all of the sequence is there, nobody has misinterpreted anything. And this is absolutely something that we were not looking for, because you'd be crazy to start a project looking for something you think didn't exist. And this was a case where, so I was talking with a colleague, and we were looking at this, and he said, well, they could just be newly evolved genes, which was this idea that I was kind of reluctant to step over into, but then talking with a colleague and then working with other people pushed us in that direction. And then we looked at it, and then we checked a few more things, and it was really, really clear. And so this was then the first time that anybody had discovered completely new human genes. But it's not something anybody does on their own. So we did it with publicly available data from big genome projects, we talking with other people, sharing ideas. And this became a piece of work we're really, really proud of. But, so my name and my student's name went on the paper, but really there's a lot more to it than that. So it's really, really important to talk to people so that you find the direction and sometimes get you thinking in a different way and understand sometimes the confusing things you might be presented with. Another thing we do is we try to understand better human genetic diversity. So there's essentially 2 main kinds of diversity I already mentioned. So if you have 2 different individuals, they might have a different letter at a particular point in the DNA sequence. So that's one way that people can be different from each other genetically. And the second one is they might have extra copies. So that's what I just mentioned as well. Sometimes people have extra copies. And so here, this blue rectangle is supposed to be a gene, and this whole piece of DNA has just been inserted again into the genome, so you have an extra copy of it. So it turns out this second kind of variation is very common, and it is actually the most common kind of variation you see in humans, mostly because they're big and there's a lot of DNA in these, and sometimes it's really important. So there's a really nice example. So the amylase enzyme in spit that's involved in starch digestion. So in countries, in regions where starch is in the staple diet, so for example, in Japan and China, where they eat a lot of rice, they have more copies of the amylase gene. So there's a long history of a starch-rich diet, and we see this reflected in the genetics of the people who have been living in these areas and eating that diet for a long time. So sometimes this can be actually apparently important in terms of adapting to your an adapted lifestyle. But basically, with all of these kind of differences, one thing that's very, very clear is that everybody carries lots of genetic changes. So I think each of us has about 60 mutations that weren't present in our parents, so 60 new mutations just to you, which is just the 1-letter mutations, and then some more of those bigger copying type mutations. And so this is one of the reasons why everybody is different from each other, because we all carry lots and lots of mutations and lots of new mutations that are just specific to us. So in one way, you can say everybody is a mutant. And part of what we do then is we try to understand this and interpret it. And there's this nice analogy for trying to understand it, which comes from this guy, Abraham Wald, who's a statistician working in World War II. This is supposed to be a drawing of a plane that you might almost recognize. But so Abraham Wald was a statistician, and the Air Force in World War II asked for his help. They asked him to come and look at the planes returning from battle and to look at the distribution of bullet holes. So this is supposed to show you over lots and lots of planes. If you map the bullet hole onto the position on the plane, this is combined over lots and lots of planes. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to reinforce their planes, but they couldn't just slap thicker metal over the whole plane, because first of all, it's wartime and metal is in short supply, and second of all, you probably make it too heavy to fly eventually. So they needed to judiciously reinforce certain parts of the plane, and they thought, well, this statistician can help us. And so the story goes that he said to them that he was given the job of looking for the highest concentration of bullet holes, and that's where they would reinforce. And so the story goes anyway that he said, okay, I'll take the job, but you've got your logic completely backwards. So if you imagine, so the planes are out flying over a battlefield, and the bullets are just firing up randomly. Some of them are hitting, some of them are not hitting, some of them are hitting one place or another, and some of those planes are shot down. So when you're looking at the planes that are returning to the Air Force Base, you're looking at the ones that were not shot down. So what you need to do is you need to look, so the ones that were shot down are the ones that were shot apparently in the critical place, like the engine or the fuel tank or whatever. I know a lot about planes, you can tell. So what he said was actually, what we don't do, we don't look for the concentration of bullet holes. We look for the absence of bullet holes over lots and lots of planes. And this is exactly the same thing that we do with genetics. So when we're looking at genetic variation, we're trying to interpret it. We're thinking, so the bullets in this case are mutations, and they happen randomly, more or less. So you have them mutations hitting randomly. And we're looking for places where you see no hits in living individuals. So this means over huge evolutionary time, this means these are the individuals that didn't survive because there was a mutation in a point in the DNA that meant they couldn't live with that. So you have a disruption of a gene that's incompatible with life. And then if you look over human populations, you can think about individuals who have a condition and individuals who don't have a condition. And if you look at healthy individuals, all of the mutations carried in healthy individuals, you say, well, these are ones you can live with. And then the other ones, you start thinking about maybe some of these ones that we don't see in healthy individuals or that are rare in healthy individuals, they might be the ones that we're interested in. So you start applying this logic, the same kind of logic of the airplanes, you apply that to genetics and you can start understanding something more about it. And this is one of the things we're doing with trying to understand evolutionary genetics in the context of human disease. So that's another way where we're trying to think about things differently. So one of the things about genetics is that, so you'll see it everywhere. So the top left one is from the new Jurassic Park film, and they have the DNA helix going the wrong way, but this happens a lot. But apparently they were able to do amazing things with their genetic engineering program. Genetics is not an excuse, says Bart Simpson, and people can wear this T-shirt these days and everybody gets the joke. So genetics is one of these areas of science that has really, really successfully invaded popular culture, I think. So everybody knows a little bit about genetics, but there's a certain thing that everybody thinks, or many people think they know about genetics, which isn't quite true. And that is that people think that genetics is much more deterministic than it is, that if you have certain genes, you will be X and you won't be Y. And actually this relates, so tomorrow there's the film Gattaca showing in the IFI, and I'm actually introducing it with Sean O'Boyle, but one of the things about that film is it imagines this future where everybody has basically made this mistake, where everybody has decided that actually genes are really, really deterministic and they strongly dictate what you are, what you can be, and what you cannot be. And then if you've seen the film, I don't want to spoil too much for you, but it's not quite true. So, I like that film for that reason. It's almost 20 years old now, I just realized. But so because it gets a bit more subtle in this point. And so this is a subtlety in genetics, and that even though we can know everything about your DNA, so you could give a spit sample and we could sequence your entire DNA and we still don't know everything about you biologically speaking. I'm not even talking about all the extra things that make you interesting, but even just biologically speaking, we don't know everything about you. And so genetics is not as deterministic as people think it is. And so I already mentioned eye color, because this is the one, probably the favorite, where people think genetics is very heritable. So these are simple examples. It's not actually one gene, though. So it gets often used as an example of where there's one gene. But there are a few genes, which is why eye color isn't just so simple. The blue. There's more than one kind of blue, and there's more than one kind of brown. But it is genetic in the sense that your genes do determine your eye color very clearly. Something a bit more complex is height. So this is a famous old photograph where the individuals in white are female and the individuals in black shirts are male. So we have two graphs kind of superimposed upon each other, and everybody's standing behind the marker, which is their height. And so you can see this follows the expected bell curve. Even just within males, you have this bell curve. It's probably the same within females, though the axis has been skewed because they're all put behind the men, which is a bit shitty, really. If we did it again, we should do it the other way around. So height is very, very heritable. So this is a special word we use in genetics. It has a precise meaning. So in terms of how much your genetics determines your height, if you want to guess the height of a baby, the best thing you can do is measure the height of their parents, and you've got a really, really good estimation of how tall that baby will grow to when they're an adult. Yet, we don't understand the genetics of it. So there's all these things that are very, very complicated. So there are many different pieces of DNA, many different variants that contribute to variation in height. I saw a paper, I think it was last year, where they claimed to have discovered 200 new ones, which is why you don't have, as you did in Mendel's P's, tall and dwarf, we don't have just tall people and dwarf people. We've got this distribution of heights because of all these different pieces of information in the DNA which are contributing in different ways. So even in a case that's very heritable, we don't fully understand it because genetics is difficult, and it's very important to acknowledge the stuff you don't understand. Otherwise, you can be falsely confident and then go quite far wrong. And so starting to understand that genetics wasn't quite as straightforward as had been thought or supposed was very, very important in terms of understanding something more subtle about genetics. And this is something that's called epigenetics, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. So you might have heard of epigenetics. Epigenetics gets it gets misused a lot as a term. So epi just means on top of. So epigenetics is on top of genetics. I'm going to explain what this means in a second. So you might hear about it as things like, this person is fat because their great-grandfather lived in a famine, or the other way around, or something. Anyway, that's all nonsense. And so that's when or meditate yourself. Meditation to be, anyway, there's all kinds of crazy links. People say meditate yourself to have a better mental health. Actually, that example might even help in some cases, but some people claim specific things like, your heart health, meditate for your heart health and you can change your genes and stuff like that. All that stuff's rubbish. But what epigenetics really is basically, it's a description of the role that probability can sometimes play in, or chance and stochastic events can sometimes play in genetics. So in this case, you have a marble that comes into the top here, and it can fall in any of these different containers at the end. And that's going to happen according to probability, right? So the marble coming at the top, you don't know, if I put in a new marble there, you have no idea where it's going to land. You can't tell me it's going to land in the far right or in the far left. But if I do 100 marbles, you can tell me that I'm going to get something like a bell curve distribution. So you can't tell you something about a specific individual, but I can say on average, this is what it's going to look like. More marbles are going to be in the middle and fewer marbles on the edge. And so in terms of genetics, the idea is, so there's this thing called a epigenetic landscape, which is due to a guy called Waddington. He first described this, and it looks like this. So it's the marble going down again. But in this case, not everything is completely even. Not all the channels have the same width. So the distribution, the shape of this landscape is your genetics. So your genetics aren't going to force things to go left or right, but they might have a slightly wider channel to the left or to the right, which means it's just a bit more likely you'll go this way. So when we talk about somebody having a predisposition to something, we're not saying their genes are going to make them definitely have this. We're just saying it's a bit more likely on average. So so you can think of when the marbles are going down this landscape, some of them go left and some of them go right. And so this is probably one of the one of the more important ideas to understand about genetics, now that we've got this far, that everybody has heard about DNA and heard about genes, and you hear people commonly saying it's in your genes or your genes make you do it, and it's to understand that it's not quite so simple, that even when you have a genetic component to something, a very strong genetic component to something, it still doesn't necessarily dictate the outcome. And understanding that has been really important in understanding genetics better, in understanding confusing results, so in puzzling over problems. And I think it's also a very useful thing for people in general to understand, because otherwise there can be a very high expectation of what you can and cannot do in terms of learning from genetics. So it's a difficult, complex science, and in understanding better the bits we don't know, what we're doing when we do that is we're identifying the places we would like to learn more. So that's where it's really interesting. So that's basically all I wanted to say. I wanted to put this up here just because I don't have any justification for doing it. I just think it's really cool, and so I just arbitrarily throw it in. And then I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any. So thank you very much.